You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, former Indianapolis mayor and prosecutor of Marion County, Stephen Goldsmith. We are joined by our frequent co-host, Hall of Famer, Jim Shella. Jim, thank you for making it.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Mayor, thank you for making it.
My pleasure, I think.
Unlike your other interviews with Shella, this will get edited to your benefit.
Oh, good. Yeah, that would be unusual, yes.
The others got edited.
It's not to your benefit. Go ahead, Jim. You take it.
Wow. You bring us up to speed. You're still a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, correct?
I am. I specialize in programs for mayors, chiefs of staff, chief data officers of the largest U.S. cities.
So you're talking about municipal issues primarily.
Yeah, my little world is the intersection between technology, leadership, innovation, and cities. That's what I pay attention to. How to innovate in cities, and more often than not, using new technologies.
And that includes AI at this point, does it?
It does, yes.
Tell me how AI gets employed in city government.
Well, we could probably spend a long time on this. Well, I'll make it so short that maybe you can't even figure out what I've said. But actually, let's go back like 50 years to when I was mayor for a second. Indianapolis was probably the first city, I think absolutely the first city in the country to put services online. And in fact, we owned the URL eGov so early. And then that digital revolution has continued and picked up momentum. Then it was joined by this kind of open data concept where the city's data would all be up online like Indianapolis is now. Yet, the number of individuals in a city and in community groups who actually take advantage of that data is relatively limited because it can be accessed by data geeks at Purdue, but not necessarily everybody in city government. Generative AI promises, I think, maybe the most substantial revolution in productivity because it will allow many more individuals in the city government to inquire of the data, like what caused that pothole, or a community group to say, well, how do my services compare to the ones down the road? So just to shorthand it, I think the uses are going to be enormous as we use kind of natural language to interact with the data rather than need coders and scientists.
So it was only like 30 years ago, not 50.
Well, maybe it felt like 50.
Right. Well,
it was 30 years ago.
Trying not to date myself. Among the other things that you brought to government was privatization.
Yes.
Tell me, looking back, how your privatization experience worked out.
Well, it's a good question. Let me modify it slightly. And I think this is more than nominal. We moved from an overt privatization to a managed competition, meaning that if we put a service up for bid and let our workers bid on it and gave them all the resources, consulting, and technology they needed, that they might be able to change the way they did business. This was based on what at the time was a well-known phrase that we had good people and bad systems. We didn't make that phrase up. It was taken from Reinventing Government. So, for example, when the sanitation haulers bid, they increased their productivity by 25 or 30%. They shared in performance bonuses, and they kept 60% of the business. So, in retrospect, I think we probably did it correctly, although not everything worked well. Some things worked, some things didn't work. And the challenge was not doing something less expensively. The challenge was doing it better and less expensively. And that means you had to get the service level agreements. What is the definition of quality as well as quantity? And so some we got right and some we didn't, but all in all, I'm pretty proud of what we accomplished.
You also brought in some faith-based initiatives. Most memorable, I think, is probably the 10-Point Coalition that still exists.
Yes.
I assume you consider that a success.
Yes. So we took I'm going to connect your last two questions. We took the savings from privatization and managed competition and invested those disproportionately in the communities that have been most neglected since World War II, like the one we're sitting in right now, but which is obviously much better off. And even with injecting hundreds of millions of dollars in sidewalks and libraries and police stations and parks, there was the fundamental issue that a community is not, it requires basic, well done public services, but it really thrives on its own civic infrastructure. And many of these communities were hanging on by a thread at the time. The primary asset was the church. You say church, mosque, or synagogue, but it basically was a church. And it wasn't the mega churches. It was the churches of 500 folks with a part-time pastor. And so the question then became, how could we partner with them? Not to advance their evangelical mission, but how could we partner with them to advance their preschool or their use of the abandoned park as a safe playground? I mean, the abandoned home as a safe playground. And we brought the 10-Point Coalition in on the theory that we couldn't arrest our way into safety. We needed to build up the stature and the intervention capability of folks in that community. So yeah, I did think of the 10-Point Coalition as a success.
So you've had a long and varied career. You started out as a prosecutor. You became a mayor. You worked in the federal government. You were deputy mayor in New York City. You spent a long time at Harvard. What was the best job?
Mayor of Indianapolis was the best job. I was prosecutor here for 12 years, and which was longer than I intended, actually. But I was prosecutor here for 12 years. And I think I did a lot of good as prosecutor, but prosecutor, you're actually dealing with the results of a system that doesn't quite work, right? If you think about it, a prosecutor is too far at the end of the life cycle. How do you intervene earlier? And New York City was a wonderful job. And I loved working for Mike Bloomberg, but it's not the same. Being one of the top agents for the principal is not the same as being the principal. We did a lot of things here that you covered in others as controversial that you can do when you're using your own political capital. So I liked being mayor more than anything I've ever done.
I want to go back to that. You said you were a prosecutor longer than maybe you wanted to be. You were waiting for Bill Hudnut to move on. There were a lot of stories of friction between you and Hudnut. Were they accurate?
Yes. They weren't accurate by today's definitions of friction, honestly. They were there for a couple reasons. One, I was a pretty aggressive prosecutor, and I prosecuted a lot of Republicans. And that meant that I was prosecuting people that worked for either the mayor or the governor, which was uncomfortable. And I think Bill knew I wanted to be mayor, right? So there was a little bit of that. And I was a little young and impatient. We later on, after we both had retired as mayors and repaired our relationship, I realized it could have been better at the time than it was. But yeah, there was a little bit of friction, yes.
Let's go back to prosecutor. You didn't just go after Republicans and people in government. You had some death penalty cases.
13.
Yeah. And if I've got it correct, some of those produced some threats.
Yeah.
You were, as prosecutor, you traveled with security, which was unusual.
Yeah. Well, I'll explain it. I'll answer your kind of question. Let me just say that every job I've had, elected job, I've loved the job and been obsessed with doing it well, like 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless if people agreed with me or not. And so as prosecutor,
I've heard stories of you sending emails while you're on the treadmill.
I've done that. Yes. Now you can do it. Now you can do it with voice. It's much easier than you could at the time. Some of the spelling was a little.
Or say, "Hey, Loftus, just run with me."
Yeah. So yeah. We're pretty active, and some of those death penalties. I mean, the ones that I remember the most was waking up one morning. Had a police radio at the time, and we had been working on with a police officer named Jack Orberg on a really serious matter. And I picked up the radio, and I knew Jack. We'd worked, I was working on the case with him, and he was working on the case. I was just causing trouble, but I felt like I was helping. And I heard that he'd been shot, right, trying to serve the warrant on the bank robbers called the Resnovers. And that whole group, I went down to interview the guy who shot him in the jail after they made the arrest. And I said, why did you do that? And he said, and I remember this guy said, well, we had done target practice and we meant to shoot you. Right. And I sat there and I couldn't figure out what to say. Right.
This was Gregory Resnover?
Or Tommy Smith.
I can't remember which one it was. It was one of them.
Okay.
Wasn't Tommy Smith. It was one of the Resnovers. And at any rate, there was a series of kind of threats that were uncomfortable. Yeah.
Were you in fear of your life?
Well, I had police officers. I was more worried about the intrusion on my family. Like, this is I'm not a president. I'm just a prosecutor. It's unusual I had security, but I did, when I left, there wasn't like security left at the home with my kids and wife and all. So it was, it was unpleasant.
I just want to note that, and Jim, I want you to continue, but as I sit here wearing my Hal Hornets shirt, that Jack Orberg lived right across the street from Ellenberger Park on Ritter, and he was in my friend Jason Kimmel's, he was on his paper route, his Indy Star route, and Orberg was assassinated.
Yes, with an automatic weapon. Absolutely.
And they knew he was coming.
Go
ahead, Jim. Rest in peace, Jack.
Well, moving on, when you first ran for mayor, you ran against Louis Mahern, former state senator. And I recall that as the first real campaign for mayor of Indianapolis, with television on both sides and big money. It was something different.
Well, I mean, he was a quality guy. He was intelligent. He had served. There was some anxiety about me even in my own party, for some of the reasons we've already discussed. And I wasn't sure what the outcome was going to be until the very end.
It wasn't all that close, as it turns out.
That was a few, it was
closer than 87, closer than 83. Yeah.
Well, it was like 3 points, I think, 3 to. It wasn't all that close in the end, but I felt like it was going to be close, and I was never actually sure I was going to win. I was more sure I was going to win in 96 than I was when I ran against Louis.
Really?
When you ran for governor.
When I ran for governor, yeah.
And your point about Louis, Louis came on the podcast. He and John Mutz came on together because they're close friends. He talked about it a little bit. And one of the things, if I can recall correctly, is that the Democrats felt like the county was turning. It just wasn't turning enough yet.
I think that's a fair assumption. It was still a little Republican, and that's why I won, not because.
Well, and Louis tried to make education the issue of the race, and turns out education became a big issue for mayors in the future, but it was down the road from
I think
there.
that's exactly right.
Well, IPS was 91, I'd already graduated. I graduated from Howell in 86, but IPS was still doing pretty well in the late 80s, relatively speaking, compared to some of the trials it's had lately that fostered the charter school movement, which, according to now guess, Jim, guess who I contacted today to get briefed on this podcast? Take a guess.
Oh, gosh.
Who did I call to get the scoop about Stephen Goldsmith?
Joe Loftus?
No, close. Darlene Sherman.
Who served as spokesperson.
Yeah.
Darlene, I would say you had some very loyal staffers, and Darlene was probably as loyal as any of them.
She was good. We had people who worked really hard, believed in the cause, and they've stayed friends since.
Well, I texted her this morning. I've received 2 phone calls, 2 emails, and 2 texts in the first few hours after it. It shows, I told her, I said, you are to Steve Goldsmith what I am to Greg Ballard. Like always, the musket's always next to your body, ready to get going.
Yeah, but what surprises me is that she didn't tell me what to say to you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But she mentioned that you were one of the ones who really, which I didn't know, started the charter school discussion and movement.
Yeah, no, I didn't start the movement. I started the discussion. I failed at starting the movement.
She intimated there was a little bit of partisanship there and the delay of the charter.
Well, in this state, though, the charter school discussion, it started with the Democrats, correct?
No, I tried to do a charter school while I was mayor, and I brought the first Edison charter school group here, and it went nowhere. And then they went up to Carmel after they failed here, and the Carmel parents have said that they didn't trust a for-profit school to educate their children, which I thought was strange in Carmel, by the way. But here's why Bart Peterson succeeded. This is a good story because I failed. So I went to the legislature, and in a horrible fight, Loftus was there with the unions about pay for performance for teachers because I was so exasperated with IPS by the middle of my term for a whole bunch of reasons. So the unions kept saying, you don't want to pass this because IPS is not confident enough to do this. And I said, that's just politics. And we pickets and yelling and screaming, the law passed. IPS enacted it horribly. Bart gets elected and goes to the legislature and says, if you get rid of that awful piece of legislation that Goldsmith was responsible for, I'll take mayoral charters. So he would never have succeeded but for me.
Does he know this?
Oh, yes. Because he threw me under the bus.
Was that the key schools and stuff that IPS had going on?
When he got the Indianapolis.
Him and Teresa Lovers, is that right?
That's when Bart got the authority to charter. He's the only mayor in the country, and it was a really big deal, and he did it totally correctly. He held schools accountable. He fired the ones that weren't performing. It was a terrific model.
I remember when Ballard came in, John Mutz, former lieutenant governor, was the head of the charter school thing. We always felt like we were in really good hands. And when former Mayor Peterson came on, I asked him, why did you decide to run for a 3rd term? And he didn't hesitate. He said, charter schools. He goes, I wanted to protect charter schools, even though if you launched that campaign during the debates, especially, then candidate Greg Ballard was very supportive of what Bart Peterson wanted to do.
But Bart had done just a great job with charter schools, really. It's a national model, and Mind Trust became.
So when you ran for a 2nd term, your opponent was Z. May Jimison, who didn't have the kind of party support you would hope to have.
Or money.
That poor commercial with her and Evan Bayh looked like it was done on a Betamax. I just remember that.
She was a really nice person.
Well, I was just going to say, not just nice. She was, I thought she was intelligent and articulate.
Oh, no, I didn't.
I moderated a debate between the two of you, and I came away impressed with her performance, but also knowing that nobody was ever going to hear about it.
Well, I didn't mean nice as kind of, I didn't mean it to suggest the other. Look, I knew her as a judge. I never had a problem with her. I mean, she was a little more liberal on some of the criminal justice issues than I was, but she was analytic and smart, and Yeah, she was, but she couldn't win. I mean, in fairness, she didn't have any money, and it was still slightly Republican city, county, and so I won. I won. It was that race was closer than I expected it to be, though. By that time I had I had prosecuted or offended a majority of people in Indianapolis.
But I remember in that year, you actually did a commercial, and correct me, please. You did a commercial that said, I'm thinking about running for governor, because they were trying to use that against you. And you said, I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I may have said it. I don't think I would have done a commercial, but I may have said it. I don't remember, but I didn't. I was thinking about it.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. Our guest today, former Mayor Stephen Goldsmith, and we're joined by Jim Shella. Jim, keep going.
Well, so you run for governor in '96, and you said you thought you were going to win it. And tell me if I've got the facts correct here. You employed a polling group. I think it's the Terrence Group. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And it's my understanding you asked for some money back afterward.
Yeah. Well, look, there were so many thing I did when we had campaign that you can't blame anyone, but they were the elite national polling group at the time, and it didn't feel like when I was going around like I was ahead, but they said I was ahead by 6 points on election day, and we ran a campaign as if we were ahead. There were a bunch of other things that went wrong, but yes, that's correct.
Okay. Well, because I remember that because I was at Wish TV and we employed Brian Vargas as a pollster. A lot of people in politics, he had students make phone calls at IUPUI and feel free to weigh in, Robert. His work was not always highly regarded inside political circles, let me say. But he had that one pretty well nailed.
Yeah, right, he did. I remember I was a little worried when I read that before the election. You know, like I said, when I went around, folks didn't seem all that enthusiastic, actually, about me.
Were both of you surprised at the outcome, or at what point did you know? We obviously don't want to dwell, but at what point did you know, okay, this is what's going to happen?
Well, for my part, we had a late poll from Vargas that turned out being pretty accurate, and that's the only time I remember Wish TV paying for exit polling information. And about midday, we got the first wave of exit polling information, and it overlaid the Vargas poll almost exactly. And so I think I went on the air early in the evening and said Frank O'Bannon's going to win this race, and Darlene Sherman came out with her hair on fire.
That's my girl.
But I would have done and said, how can you say this? And I said, because we got these numbers and we got to believe in our numbers. And
yeah.
Was 88 when you were lieutenant governor candidate with John Mutz? Mm-hmm. Was that the first time that you, I'm not going to say traveled around the state, but had a real sense of statewide politics? And did that inform your 96 campaign at all?
That's an interesting question. I don't think our 96 campaign was all that well informed. But that's a comment about me, not the people who are advising me. Well, it's a big state, and Indiana is more varied than folks not in Indiana give us credit for, right? This is like 3 states, like Indianapolis region in the center and Democrat North, and at the time, Southern Democrat South. Obviously, that's turned, and lots of different variety. It was fun to get to know all those folks. I had great respect for John. I kept thinking if I could get up to 18 hours a day and tell people about John Mutz, we'd win. But Evan was one heck of a candidate in his own right. So it informed it in that I realized how much variety there was. But I was basically an Indianapolis politician at the time. This was pre-Mitch. There hadn't been a governor from Indianapolis. Mm. And there was a bunch of other things. And so I think that we didn't pay enough attention to how I might relate or not to folks outside of the region. outside the Indianapolis region.
You're saying there was an anti-Indianapolis bias outstate?
Yeah, well, I think there was an anti-Indianapolis bias. I'm not saying there's an anti-Goldsmith bias, but if you lived in Lake County, you thought you weren't getting your fair share of resources from Indianapolis. The same is true, so Indianapolis was kind of a curse word you used to mean this. You often meant the state capital, but you said Indianapolis. Then I was kind of a big city mayor, right? And I would I don't want to spend the whole podcast on this, but Frank was a really nice guy, right?
From Southern Indiana.
All
those conservative Democrats.
Easy to relate to. Even if he was not more conservative than I was on the issues, he seemed more conservative, and he related better. And so that's a long way of saying I learned about 88 and Form 96 as related to policy issues. I don't think 88 and Form 96 is related to Goldsmith personality issues. I'd say I was still the prosecutor mayor of Indianapolis and was as abrupt as I'd ever been.
What we're talking about here is your ambition. I mean, you started out as a prosecutor. You had an ambition to be mayor. You had an ambition to be governor.
Yes.
When you teach students at Harvard, what do you tell them about ambition?
I don't talk much about ambition. I haven't really thought much about it. I teach them a lot about bold leadership, which to me is.
But I think some of your opponents used to attack you.
Ann Delaney.
I think she would refer to you as ambition in a suit.
Wait a second. Who has she not attacked?
Well, she's pretty effective at that, I would say. But you have to have ambition, don't you, in order to succeed?
Well, you have to have ambition for sure. I guess, and I definitely did, obviously. But I would distinguish between the politicians who have ambition in order to get elected and the politicians who have ambition to get elected in order to do stuff, right? So if your goal of your ambition is your own profile, and the election is not an ends to means, it is the end, that ambition feels to me like a really dangerous thing, as contrasted to all politicians who want a higher office are, by definition, at least the successful ones, are ambitious. And I think I was, maybe too much so. I don't know. When I ran in 96, I'd studied Ed Koch in New York City, won for mayor by like 2/3, immediately announced for governor, and lost New York City. Yeah. And so I looked at that, and I said, that's just him. And then the same exact thing happened to me.
But some of in Ed Koch's case, that's because people saw him as a mayor, but not as a governor.
Yes.
Do you think that was your problem?
Yes.
Yeah, but New York was a disaster in the 70s and 80s. And
he wasn't such a good mayor. In Indianapolis, of course, I didn't win Indianapolis. I won Indianapolis by a pretty good margin as mayor, and then lost Indianapolis for governor 6 months later, a year later, but 6 months of the primary and the like. So I chalk it up to the fact that people like me so much as mayor, they want to keep me.
May I ask a question?
That's a good spin.
Now, Lane would be proud.
Thank you.
May I ask a question about, we were talking about political stuff, and then I want to move on because I want to talk about urban republicanism as a governance, because that's what I kept pushing Mayor Ballard and others. But you talked about making amends with Mayor Hudnut. Were you ever able to with Rex Early?
No.
And for the benefit of the listeners, you defeated Rex in a primary for governor in 96.
Yeah, probably the most uncomfortable election I've ever been in. Rex didn't really want to talk to me after that, and I'm not sure that it wasn't mutual. I pretended it wasn't mutual.
Rex was good at holding a grudge.
He was really quite upset with me, and that was a really...
But I mean, we did a podcast on Rex's memory, and Delaney was on along with Murray and Jim. I mean, politics is a rough sport. Why do you think that 96, did Did you do something in particular that made him angry?
Well, I think he was state party chairman, and he had been a long time operative, and not in the bad sense, in the Republican Party, and he thought it was his. And I was, not from that part of the party,
Right.
and not particularly close to Rex, and I think he viewed me as doing something fundamentally wrong. And and I was kind of a reform candidate, not using that word, and coming from outside the party. I mean, the party, I wasn't that popular with the state party at the time, if you remember. And so, I don't know.
Well, the state committee had almost entirely been hand-selected by Rex. So it was his party. But that primary was not close.
It was not close. We spent a lot of money, but I think it left a lot of pain and resentment. Folks did not come back, I think, in the primary.
In the general.
In the general, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We're also a federally certified, veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Vane. Our producer is Chris Spangle. Our guest, former mayor, former prosecutor for Marion County, Steve Goldsmith. We are joined by Jim Shella.
Say, before you go on, to get away from politics, let me just say one gratuitous thing. Even after I lost for governor, and I was still mayor, and the same was true when I was mayor and Evan was governor as it was when Frank was governor. I never had a single issue that I couldn't deal with Frank and Evan up front. Sometimes Evan didn't agree with me, but he would just say, we can't do this, Goldsmith. But when he said we would do it, he did it. And when I went to Frank and I wanted to do this whole state park thing, I mean, the state park was there, but I wanted to redo the White River, and I wanted to bring the Indians in. In fact, Patterley was kind of the lead for that.
Rex's son.
Yeah.
Even after I ran against Frank, we never had any problem on doing what was right for the city, and either for Frank or Evan. And it's just worth saying, because people ought to pay a little attention to this today.
You anticipated one of my questions here in about 5 minutes, but you guys did work on big projects together that you could only have gotten done, I'm assuming, if the state was a partner.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you about lots of things, but I want to do something that I'd love to do a podcast on this, and we haven't done it, not on it per se, but the folks. And that is, I'm going to suggest that September 11th, 1992 was the worst day of your time, not only as mayor, but as an elected official. And that was the day of the plane crash. Bob Welch.
Oh, yeah. Michael
Carroll. Frank McKinney. There's one more that's escaping me at the moment, but it was the three of them.
John Welliver.
And they were on a trip that involved the White River State Park.
They were all board members of the White River State Park, and they were on their way to Columbus, Ohio, to visit a park there.
Florist. There was a flower. I remember, because I was supposed to go.
You were supposed to go?
You were supposed to be on that plane?
Well, they wanted me to be on the plane. We talked about it, and I said, I'll think about it. And then I thought, well, is a florist event, is a flower event really right? It saves the White River State Park, because that was before the park became much of anything, and those guys were leading it. And Welliver I liked Welliver. He was I mean, I liked all of them, but I remember Welliver was the one behind it in particular. Mike Carroll was behind everything in Indianapolis at the time.
A man I wish I would have known. Everybody. I asked P.E. McAllister once about Michael Carroll, and P.E. said he was a host unto himself.
Yeah. So it was a huge loss for the city. Yeah, for sure. I do remember it pretty vividly.
Steve Goldsmith went to Broad Ripple High School, a proud IPS kid, and then matriculated to this little college called Wabash. I think I'm up to 50% of my guests having attended Wabash, only because we had Grand on. We need to have him on again.
And the governor, I understand.
And the governor, and Mark Miles, and the list goes on and on.
It is a little school, though.
Who
have we had Todd Rokita on?
No. Who was at Wabash when you were there that you can think of?
That you would know?
Yeah, like
What?
people in the public. There was none, because like Miles and Braun, I think, were in the same class. Governor
Miles
Braun.
after me. I don't know who would have been there.
Is Grand younger than you?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody is younger than me. Everybody you can possibly name is younger than me.
What is Wabash? Why has it been so successful in? I went in the Army after high school, so I don't have any frame of reference. But what is Wabash? It's got something special that it turns out people like Ryan Vaughn and Mark Miles and David Brooks, and the list goes on.
I benefited because there wasn't anything to do except study, right? No women, and
What are you going to do in
Robertsville, Indiana. So, therefore,
Did you learn? I mean, is that something where you're like, I still think of my days at Wabash? Because there is a group of people in this city and state, and that's their
I
common
look at
link.
Wabash a little bit differently, but consistently. I look at Wabash as the place where I learned to study and learn. Right. In Broad Ripple, I didn't really study.
And you're pre-Letterman at Broad Ripple, or were you there together?
We were there at the same time.
Did you know him?
A little bit. He was funnier than I was. I was on one night.
On a show?
Top 10. Yeah, Indianapolis was featured. Reggie Miller and me. They paid more attention to Reggie. I can't figure out why.
That's cool.
How much did law school prepare you for your public service?
Well, when I was in Wabash, I decided I wanted to be mayor. Talking about ambition. Dick Lugar motivated me to want to be mayor. When I was at Broad Ripple High School, he wrote. Do you know this story? Did you ever hear this story?
No. But I was going to say, like Dick Lugar, you were an Eagle Scout.
That's
I
right.
was.
Right.
So I became president or something like the student council at Broad Ripple High School, and Dick Lugar wrote me a letter. He was head of the school board. I saved this letter until like 5 years ago. It was the most important letter I'd ever received. Said, "Congratulations. I hope this will lead you to a path of public service." Right. Then he became mayor, like he was Rhodes Scholar, mayor. Did all these great things. So I thought I wanted to be mayor when I was in. So when I went to law school in order to learn how to think critically, analytically. I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be mayor. You can't go to mayor school, so I went to law school. Really. So that was why I was there.
Stephen Goldsmith graduated from Broad Ripple in 64, Wabash in 68, law school 71-ish.
More or less, yeah.
What made you run for prosecutor? And I remember you as prosecutor. I was born in 67, so I remember your time as prosecutor really well. You beat Andrew Jacobs Sr.
Shouldn't have. He was an honorable guy. He should have won. It was a mistake.
Jim, do you want to take it from here?
I'm just like, I should never have won. I almost apologized after I won.
It was in 78, so it was in the midterm of President Carter's time, midterm of the second term of Otis Bowen, Indianapolis, heavily Republican, Marion County, Unigov, and all that. But Andy Jacobs was unassailable except for one time in 72 when he lost to Bill Hudnut. And 74, he comes back and he wins in the Watergate year. You defeated one of the absolute titans of Marion County Democratic lore.
It was a mistake. So,
how?
First of all, I got nominated. The only reason I came back and I was practicing law because I couldn't figure out how to become mayor. So I practiced law. And I was volunteering and doing all things. And then Andy Jacobs Sr. decided he wanted to be prosecutor. He was a no-nonsense judge that everybody respected. And so no Republican would in the group of the Republican Party would want to run for prosecutor because it was a waste of time. So I could get nominated because nobody else wanted to get nominated. That's the only reason I ever got anywhere, is I got nominated for that job because nobody else wanted it. And then I was 29 and he was 75, and he said, "This is a campaign," or you said, Shella, or somebody did, "This is a campaign of the juvenile versus the senile." And I said,
That wasn't me.
That sounds like you, though. I mean, that's a legit guess, right?
So I said, "At least I'll grow up. I can't know what's going to happen." So I recruited high school students, and we went door to door, 15 hours a day in shifts. They would do I did 3 groups as high school kids, 5-hour shifts until I got to 50,000 doors, and I accidentally won. I should not have won. Really. He was a good guy.
We did a podcast. I became good friends with his son, Andy Jacobs Jr., and he has a lot of respect for you, or had when he was alive.
They were both terrific public servants. I mean, I have nothing critical to say about either one of them.
What made you decide to stay prosecutor until the mayor's office came open? And the only reason I ask is because of what Jim said earlier: death threats. You're on such a public eye. You also have jurisdiction, I think at the time, over the state house and everything that happens there. And you're talking about, you said earlier you'd prosecuted Republicans. I mean,
well, there were no Democrats to prosecute in terms of public corruption. Although I did actually, there were a few. I wanted to be mayor. I wanted to be mayor since late in high school, early in college, since the Dick Lugar exchange. I wanted to be mayor. I was getting a little discouraged. You know, also the other problem was I don't think people should be prosecuted more than 2 terms. I think it's a mistake. I thought actually when I ran, I thought it was a mistake. Just because you get too cynical, it's not a job where you see the best of Hoosiers. So anyway, but I wanted to wait. So I think I could, if Bill would have run again, I don't think I would. I think I would have had to throw in the towel.
So did you have a conversation, not to divulge personal things, but in '87 when Bill Hudnut says, I'm running for a 4th term, did you have a conversation like, what are you doing?
No.
Did you ever get to weigh in on the Hudnut Forever bill?
No, I was just a prosecutor. I wasn't part of those discussions. Bill was not asking me for my advice.
Of course, Bill had some ambition too. He ran for Secretary of State with the idea that he would run for governor.
And I think he had some of the same issues. I mean, not the issues we're talking about, some of the Indianapolis issues, I think.
Right.
Because that was a race that nobody thought he would ever lose, because he was highly popular.
Against Joe Hogshead, it was the first-time candidate then, and yeah.
It wasn't particularly close, as I recall, was it?
No.
But Bill's vision, and those around him like Dave Frick's vision for the city, was extraordinary. And we owe a lot to that vision.
Dave Frick came on the podcast right after we started it. And I introduced him as the most important person in the history of Indianapolis you've never heard of.
That's true. I think that's true. He was his vision and his execution were extraordinary.
I want to talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about your relationship with the media. Because both as prosecutor and as mayor, it strikes me that you held more news conferences than others in those positions. You made a tool out of the media.
I wouldn't use that word, but go ahead.
Capital T, small t.
Small t. But you took your case to the public through the media on a regular basis.
Yes.
Yet you didn't seem to be terribly chummy with the media, if I could put it that way.
That was fair. That's an understatement.
Can you explain that?
Well, when I was mayor, we were trying to do some bold things. And there was a lot of resistance. There was resistance inside the city workforce. There was resistance inside the party. There were a lot of folks that were, the Indianapolis Star had some pretty good investigative reporters, but it felt to me like they were only listening to the people who were disaffected.
I think the Indianapolis News had some reporters that were.
Was Dick Cady News or Star?
No, but Katie had retired, so he didn't cover me.
Okay.
I'm thinking of Kathy Johnston.
Did she work for the news?
For the news.
Okay, well, that's who I meant, actually.
Yeah.
I just saw her the other day for the first time. Anyhow, so I thought I had to just kind of get over the top. I had to use television to communicate in order to build the case for what we were trying to accomplish.
Jim, did you cover Mayor Goldsmith much?
Well, you know, I
I know in the campaigns.
covered the state. I covered campaigns, and I covered the state house on a daily basis. I ended up over on the 25th floor every now and then.
Not so often.
Yeah.
Was the problem with the media, you felt like they just didn't get it?
Well, I wouldn't say, I don't know. I wouldn't say I don't think there was a problem with the media. I think that investigative reporters are engaged to investigate and disclose stuff, and I couldn't convince them that the things they were disclosing were aberrations, and so that was life. I didn't feel like I had any problem with the TV reporters. They sometimes approved of what I did and sometimes didn't. Sometimes just covered it directly. You know, Jim was more of a commentator. The people who covered me were reporters, and there wasn't enough time, and they weren't investigative reporters. They were reporters. You know, Jack Reinhardt and a couple others were deeper into the kind of what was going on. I didn't feel like I had a particular problem with the media, except for the investigative reporters who I couldn't convince that to see things my way.
Well, having known a few investigative reporters, they sometimes tend to see conspiracies where they don't exist.
Yeah. So, you know, I had one conversation with one of them, and I won't mention which one. And I said, "You guys are just cynics." And they said, "Well, of course, that's our job." Oh, well.
But I think following 16 years of Bill Hudnut building the stadium without a team and all the other things that he did how did you come up with a policy program and a vision that's like, we have to build on what he did and Mayor Lugar, but do it our own way? Was that a challenge to you, like a fun intellectual challenge?
Well, yes, but maybe not quite the way you said it. Now, remember, I had been in waiting for a long time, and I had consumed every case study, every article ever written about cities. I mean, it's how to operate them, what the visions were. And so my goal wasn't to do things differently than Bill Hudnut. But my goal was to do things my way, not just be different. So you're probably too young to remember, but Jim would remember that Bill had a great vision, but that mall was still just two holes in the ground.
Yeah.
Right. So then I took office, and when I ran for office, I was concerned about what my view would be about the mall. And I actually was not enthusiastic about the United Maintenance Hub. Actually, Louis was, and I wasn't. So there was a lot of tension between me and and this is what I told Bill Hudnut this story later in life. I went out to MIT and met with the leading expert on downtowns and said, I'm an economic conservative. Why do I want to give money to Nordstrom's? Why should I subsidize Nordstrom's, right? That's not why I got elected. And this expert went through this thing because it could be service jobs are often the first jobs of folks in neighborhoods that are underemployed. You ought to think about it as economic employment opportunities and not as a retail mall. And so then we went back and rethought the whole thing and figured out what the mall, and that's when actually the mall and the White River State Park and the expansion of Lilly, expansion of the convention center and the Pacers and all of that was part of it. So I only answer that way because I needed to save money in order to do all those things. I couldn't afford to do all those things and continue to run government the way I did. So where Bill and I disagreed, I think, is on operational efficiency. I came to see the value of building on his vision, and I'm proud of that and thanked him for it.
The city budget, dollar for dollar, in 2000 was less than it was in 1992. Property taxes were cut 5 straight years, and the COIT rate remained the same for 8 years. And the city of Indianapolis, under Mayor Goldsmith's leadership, received the AAA bond rating from the nation's largest financial agencies. So not a bad record at all while you're doing all these things.
Right. Well, we didn't. We'll kind of close with this, but I'll brag about it for a second. There was a billboard on Allisonville Road or 69 as you go out of Indianapolis that said, "Move to Anderson, property taxes are less." I still have this. I took a picture of it and I distributed it through the employees of the city county building. And I said, we cannot tax our way to wealth. We're anti-competitive. We need to be able to lower our taxes. And I also, when I got elected, we had this $1 billion infrastructure bill from the Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce. We'd like $1 billion in infrastructure.
Oh my.
right? So this doesn't add up. People are moving from, or at least people are advertising move from Indianapolis to save on your property tax bill, and we're about to impose $1 billion, and we have holes in the ground. Right? None of this is a criticism of Bill Hudnut. That's not the point. The point is, I had to save money, and to do that, I had to step. We had Republican middle managers who had been there for a long time. Actually, it wasn't clear that they were indispensable, right? And all of this stuff created its own set of turmoil in order to do the things we wanted to do. So, and that also answers your question about the press, because there was just a lot of broken glass around, and I had to communicate what I was trying to do.
I often say that if you want to make Greg Ballard smile, praise his staff, the people who worked for him. You had a monumentally talented staff. Joe Loftus, Ann Shane, Darlene Sherman, obviously Susan Brooks. What do you think about what your staff's done, the people who worked with you and for you since they left? You track all that and send them notes or call them every once in a while and say, I'm proud of you, saw you, this and that?
Yeah, we have, from the prosecutor's day, we have judges and senior officials throughout different agencies. And the people you mentioned are extraordinary. There are others as well. Some have gone on to the private sector. Many have stayed in public service. The John Tinders of the world, right? They're not had insignificant contributions to kind of public services as well. So, but look, I'm not responsible for them in the following sense. I'm lucky to have had them work for me. They're highly talented people who succeeded. We created an environment, and we deserved a lot of criticism, but our environment, the stuff we did, was always for the right reason. And that environment allowed people, like you mentioned, to flourish because they knew they could do what they thought was right, and they weren't going to be second-guessed by me.
Was it interesting for you to say, I need to mention Michael Huber too. We worked together in Greg Ballard's administration. But was it interesting to you when Mitch Daniels becomes governor and basically, there is a lot of relation between what you try to do as mayor of Indianapolis and what he tried to do as governor.
Well, Mitch was the chair of our privatization effort when he was at Lilly, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes. We agree philosophically. He was just a lot more talented politically. I don't mean just. Right? He got stuff. First of all, he won. I lost. So that's a pretty fundamental first step, right? And secondly, he managed to get it done. He's a brilliant guy with great vision and a lot of talent. So, yes, I think many of the things that he did as governor were things I aspired to do had I been elected governor. And some of the government efficiency stuff was things I did as mayor that he helped referee through the community.
One last question, then I'll let you go. We only have a few minutes left. The police. How difficult is it to navigate the relationship with the police department as mayor of Indianapolis? I always say the 5 most important jobs in Indianapolis are superintendent of IPS, mayor, IPD chief, or IMPD chief now, and head coach of the Pacers and the Colts. How do you, especially because you were prosecutor.
What about the fever?
Back in the day. How do you manage that relationship, and how tough was it given some of the things that happened while you were mayor?
Yeah, well, there was a minor police riot in downtown Indianapolis a month before the election in '96, by the way.
That had a little political effect, probably.
Huge. It had some political effect.
Yeah.
Sure.
Do you think it was because Don Crist has been a friend of mine for more than 30 years? I love him to death. Was that a dispositive event in your race, do you think?
Well,
He was chief of police
as well for such a long period of time as gubernatorial candidate in order to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory that you couldn't blame it on. But I was running on government competence. Elect me, I'll change everything because we know how to make things work in Indianapolis. And then my police chief and his top group were involved one way or another in this downtown mess. And so I think it had a big effect. not just because it was police, but because it undermined a little bit the message. Let me just go back. So I was a prosecutor for 12 years. These guys protected my life. I brought their cases. I worked with them every day. I drove at night with them in the patrol cars. I visited their precinct houses. I mean, I wasn't like remote to them.
Exactly.
And we provided them take-home cars. I mean, I was all in. I got elected mayor, and when I ran for office, the FOP helped me. But soon, after I became mayor, the relationship with the FOP was different than it was before. Not the police department, but the FOP.
Mm-hmm.
So, Indianapolis police department. Every mayor in Indianapolis has had a problem with the police department. Dick Lugar had a problem. I don't want to say anything negative about some because I had a lot of chiefs, but I couldn't find the perfect combination of me and the chief and the FOP. And it was difficult. So I think the job of a mayor is very difficult because mayor has to be able to tell the community that if a police officer does something wrong, they're going to hold them accountable, but they have to tell the police that they're going to support them if they do their job well,
Exactly.
even if they make a mistake. And obviously those things are a little bit dependent on the view of the person. So I value my relationship with the police department. I think I did an okay job as mayor, but not perfect.
And Greg Ballard ran as public safety's job one, helped get him elected, and he had his own issues with the FOP especially.
The Indianapolis crime situation, as it's evolved, is not an insignificant problem for the future of the city, though. That's not a comment about the mayor. I'm just saying that in part because the density of poverty is creating an environment of violence and hopelessness that is an issue that needs to be addressed.
Jamie, got one more for him?
When you come back to Indianapolis now and see what it's become, what do you think?
Well, I was walking around downtown today and saw the cranes. I like to count cranes. It gives me a view of kind of how active the city is. I think the downtown building continues. I'm pleased that the downtown, whatever downtown Indy is called now, I thought that tax needed to be passed because I thought the cleanliness issues needed to be improved in downtown Indianapolis. People need to come to downtown because we don't have mountains and we don't have oceans. We have Hoosier hospitality and a clean, safe place to be. So I'm proud of downtown Indianapolis and my little part in it. I was looking out at White River Park from the state office building today, and it's kind of admiring all the stuff that's done there. So I think the challenge, I'll just close on this, because I want to be careful that things I say don't look like they're being a criticism of some other mayor. One way to think about now is that we are almost back to the time when Dick Lugar created Unigov in terms of the percentage of wealth that's outside the city limits. And we need to create a better civic understanding that we're all in this together and that you can't just move out of the city and assume that it's all going to be good.
Right.
Did you catch that?
Mm-hmm.
You want me to do that again? Or are you all right?
No, you're good. I just heard my son now, Daddy.
I did. Oh.
Well, we'll edit that.
So I'm just saying that Indianapolis has a lot of great assets. It's a terrific place. We've had a series of good mayors, and I'm delighted to help and been friends of all of them. We do have challenges related to the fact that such a high percentage of the wealth of the city is now once again outside the city in the surrounding region. And the more power to the surrounding suburbs, but we need to create more of a civic commitment to the opportunity of all folks, including those in the most difficult city neighborhoods. And I view that as the challenge for the future.
You are often described as the smartest, if not one of the smartest, if not the smartest person in politics. Whose brain do you admire?
Wow, I thought we were done.
Oh no, we still got 5 more to go. 5 more layups though.
Oh, I don't think I'm going to mention anybody alive. As I said earlier, I'm an admirer of Dick Lugar's brain. and Dick Lugar's integrity. And so that's been my model for a long time.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mayor Goldsmith, are you ready?
No.
Perfect. What was your first job?
Plumber's helper on a construction site. I wasn't allowed to do the plumbing, just carry the pipes.
Where?
52nd and off of College, between College and Keystone. And they heard that I wanted to go to college, and that made it even worse.
What was your first concert?
Oh, I don't remember my first concert. I do remember a Tina Turner concert in San Francisco that was particularly appealing, but I don't remember
Tina?
first. No, Tina.
Just Tina.
Just Tina.
Okay, because I saw Ike and Tina in college. Great show.
Did you really?
Yes.
Mid-70s?
Yes. Late 70s.
I can't remember ever going to a concert before I was in college. I can't remember doing anything fun at any time in my life, actually.
So Wabash was fun?
Oh, Wabash was worthwhile.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I'm going to think about that while we get to 4 and 5. I don't know.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I should have researched these questions.
Well, unless you're Mitch Daniels, you don't get them ahead of time.
Oh.
Or Mike Pence, the former vice president, got them ahead of time.
I don't know. I think probably some Winston Churchill speech that rallied folks from a dark place.
Do you have a favorite biography of Winston Churchill?
I've read several. I couldn't tell you which my favorite was.
Should read Churchill's Citadel. We'll talk about that afterward.
Okay.
Number 5, if you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
Anyone living today. Somebody asked me this question, and I was thinking about it, but I can't think of who the... I don't know. I'll think about it, and I'll wire in the answer.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read.
Come back to both of these.
I would seem that someone like Elon Musk would be very interesting to you, like a thinker, for lack of a better term, someone who's willing to. Stop it.
No, I'm trying to identify somebody who's led during extraordinary challenges, who's alive today.
George W. Bush, someone who
I worked for George W. Bush. So I was trying to...
Do you remember 9/11? And
I kind of remember. I wasn't obviously with him at 9. I remember 9/11 because I got a call from the White House saying tomorrow when he gives a speech, he wants to announce a place for all Americans to volunteer. So make sure that I was in charge of AmeriCorps at the time.
Right.
Make sure your website works. It didn't. We had no such service at all. But I remember 9/11. I was in D.C. when the planes hit the Pentagon.
Zelensky?
Zelensky would be fascinating to me.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. Our guest today, former mayor and Marion County prosecutor, Stephen Goldsmith. We were joined, as we often are, by our good friend, Jim Shella. Jim, thank you so much.
No, thank you for that.
You make these podcasts a hell of a lot better. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. But today, we'll add to that and dedicate this conversation to Carol Johnson, the mother of my best friend growing up, and someone who admired, I know, Prosecutor Goldsmith, and someone who I know you considered a friend.
And a very talented public servant herself.